Hello everyone, and welcome back to Life Single Review. I hope this message finds you in good health and peace. If you've been following our channel, you already know the heartwarming story of D, the poor but kind-hearted man who gave everything he had to save a stranger's life. Today we're bringing you an alternative storyline, a different path that D's story could have taken. This is a special episode created by Life Single Review that explores the darker side of doing good deeds. I want you to imagine something for a moment. What if the person you risked everything to save didn't make it? What if they died and their grieving family needed someone to blame for their loss? This is exactly what happened in this version of D's story. 5 days after D rushed that injured young man to the hospital, after he paid his last $40 for medical tests, after he did everything humanly possible to help, the young man passed away, and his family, drowning in grief and anger, pointed their fingers at D. They accused him of causing the death. They said he moved the victim incorrectly, that he should have called an ambulance instead of taking matters into his own hands. This is going to be a heavy story, friends, so I need you to stick with me until the end because the message is incredibly important. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. If this story touches your heart, give it a like and share it with others. Comment below with your thoughts on this difficult situation. Now, let's begin this emotional journey. After Day brought the young man to the hospital and paid for his initial treatment, he went home with a heavy heart, but also a sense of hope. He kept thinking about that young man lying in the hospital bed, wondering if he would recover, praying that he would be okay. The next morning, D couldn't help himself. He called the hospital to ask about the patient's condition. The nurse who answered told him that the patient had been transferred to a larger hospital in the city because his injuries were more serious than they initially thought. Fractured ribs, severe head trauma, internal bleeding. The words hit D like stones. He had known the young man was badly hurt, but hearing the medical terms made it all feel so much more real, so much more dangerous. "Is he going to be okay?" D asked the nurse, his voice trembling. "We can't say for certain. The next few days are critical. His family is with him now," she replied gently. Day thanked her and hung up, then sat in silence for a long time. Huyen found him like that, staring at nothing, lost in his thoughts. "He'll be okay," she said softly, putting her hand on his shoulder. "You did everything you could. Now we just have to pray." Days 2, 3, and 4 passed in agonizing slowness. D tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to that young man. On the 5th day, Day was at home having lunch when his phone rang. Unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he answered. "Hello, is this Mr. D? The person who brought patient Min to the hospital last Tuesday?" a grave voice asked. Yes, that's me. "Is he okay? How is he doing?" D asked quickly, hope and fear mixing in his chest. There was a pause on the other end, a pause that felt like an eternity. "Mr. D, I'm Dr. Than, one of the doctors who treated the patient. I'm very sorry to inform you that, despite our best efforts, the patient passed away early this morning. His injuries were too severe." The world stopped. D heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Passed away. Dead. The young man he had tried so hard to save was gone. "No," D whispered. "No, that can't be right. He was alive. He was breathing. I got him to the hospital in time. I understand this is difficult news," the doctor continued. "The family is here at the hospital, and they've asked to speak with you. They want to know more about what happened." D's phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. Huyen rushed over. "What happened?" "Day, what's wrong?" But Day couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down his face. For hours, Dae just sat there, not moving, not speaking. Huyen tried to comfort him, but nothing she said seemed to reach him. Inside his head, a terrible voice kept repeating the same questions over and over. Did I do something wrong? Did I move him incorrectly? Should I have left him there and called for an ambulance instead? Is it my fault that he died? The guilt was crushing, suffocating. Even though logically Dee knew he had done his best, even though he knew he had acted with pure intentions, the weight of the young man's death pressed down on him like a mountain. Dae, listen to me, Huyen said firmly, taking his face in her hands. You did everything you could. You saved him from dying alone on that road. You gave him a chance. This is not your fault. But Dae shook his head. He's dead, Huyen. A young man with his whole life ahead of him is dead. And I was the last person to touch him, to move him. What if I made it worse? That night, Dae didn't sleep at all. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, seeing the young man's face every time he closed his eyes. By morning, he had made a decision. I have to go to the hospital. I need to face his family and tell them how sorry I am. Walking into that hospital felt like walking into his own trial. Dee's legs were heavy, each step harder than the last. He found his way to the family waiting area, where the nurse had told him the family would be. And there they were. A middle-aged woman sat hunched over in a plastic chair, her face buried in her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. This had to be the mother. Beside her sat a man, presumably the father. His face stone-like, but his eyes red and swollen from crying. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, stood by the window, staring out at nothing. The sister, perhaps. The grief in that room was so thick, so heavy, that Dae could barely breathe. He stood at the doorway for a moment, not knowing how to announce himself, not knowing what to say. What do you say to people whose son and brother just died? Finally, he cleared his throat softly. Excuse me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm Dee. I'm the person who brought your son to the hospital. The mother's head snapped up. Her eyes, already red and puffy from crying, locked onto Dee's face. For a moment, she just stared at him, and Dae felt like she was looking straight through him, into his soul. You, she said, her voice hoarse and broken. You're the one who found my son. Dee nodded, stepping into the room hesitantly. Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry for your loss. I did everything I could to help him. I wish things had turned out differently. Before Dee could say anything else, the mother stood up abruptly, her grief transforming into something else entirely. Anger, raw, burning anger. Why? She screamed, her voice echoing through the corridor. Why is my son dead? Why did this happen? Dae took a step back, startled by her fury. I don't know, ma'am. The accident was terrible, and his injuries were severe. The father stood up now too, his expression cold and hard. The doctor told us something very interesting, he said, his voice low and controlled, which somehow made it even more frightening than the mother's screaming. He said you moved my son. You put him on your motorcycle and drove him to the hospital yourself. Yes, sir, I did. I had to get him medical help as quickly as possible, Dee explained, his heart pounding. Do you have any medical training? The father asked sharply. Do you know anything about treating head trauma or spinal injuries? No, sir, but there was no one else there, and I couldn't just leave him bleeding on the road, Dee said desperately. The sister turned from the window, her face twisted with anguish and rage. You should have called an ambulance. You're not a doctor. By moving him, you could have made his injuries worse. You could have killed him. The words hit Dee like physical blows. The mother collapsed back into her chair, wailing. My baby. My son is dead because of this man. He killed my son. The commotion had drawn the attention of hospital staff. Dr. Than, the one who had called Dee, rushed into the room. "Please, everyone, calm down. This is a hospital," he said, trying to restore order. But the father turned his anger on the doctor. "Doctor, tell us the truth. Did this man's actions contribute to my son's death? Did moving him cause more damage?" Dr. Than looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Dee, then back at the family. "In medical terms, moving a patient with severe head trauma and possible spinal injuries without proper precautions can potentially worsen the injuries. However, in an emergency situation when professional help isn't immediately available, the decision to transport the patient quickly can also be life-saving. It's complicated." "Complicated?" the mother shrieked. "My son is dead. There's nothing complicated about that. This man killed him, and you're making excuses." "We're going to sue you," the father said coldly to Dae. "You will be held responsible for my son's death. You had no right to move him. You should have left him there and called for help." Dae felt like the world was collapsing around him. Everything was spinning out of control. 1 week later, a legal document arrived at Dee's door. It was a summons to court. The family was officially suing him for wrongful death, claiming that his actions directly caused their son's death. Dee stared at the papers in his hands, unable to process what was happening. He had tried to save a life, and now he was being accused of taking one. "This can't be real," he whispered. "This can't be happening." Huyen read the summons over his shoulder and her face went pale. "Dae, this is serious. If they win, you could face criminal charges. We need a lawyer, but we don't have money for one." That's when something unexpected happened. A local lawyer named Mr. Hai had heard about Dee's case through the community. He showed up at their door that evening, briefcase in hand. "Mr. D, I've heard your story. I don't believe for a second that you did anything wrong. I want to represent you, and I won't charge you a single dong," he said firmly. Dee nearly broke down in tears. "But why? Why would you help me?" "Because what you did was heroic, not criminal, and I can't stand by and watch a good man be destroyed for doing the right thing," Mr. Hai replied. Together, they began preparing for the trial, gathering evidence, statements from the first hospital, and medical expert opinions. The day of the trial came too quickly. Dee walked into the courtroom feeling like he was walking to his own execution. The victim's family sat on one side, dressed in black, their faces hard and unforgiving. Their lawyer was expensive-looking, confident, with a stack of documents ready to prove Dee's guilt. The prosecution argued that Dee had no medical training, that he had recklessly moved a patient with critical injuries, and that his actions had directly contributed to the young man's death. They brought in a medical expert who testified that improper movement of a head trauma patient could indeed cause fatal complications. Then it was Mr. Hai's turn. He called the emergency room doctor, who had first treated the victim, to the stand. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, if Mr. D had not brought the victim to the hospital when he did, what would have happened? The patient would have died at the scene," the doctor said clearly. "He was bleeding internally and would not have survived more than 20 or 30 minutes without intervention." But the most crucial moment came when the forensic pathologist presented the autopsy results. The primary cause of death was severe internal bleeding from the initial impact of the accident. Additionally, the victim had an undiagnosed heart condition that was exacerbated by the trauma. While the movement may have caused some additional stress, it was not the cause of death. The courtroom was completely silent as the judge reviewed all the evidence. Finally, he spoke. After careful consideration of all testimony and medical evidence, this court finds that the defendant, Mr. D, acted in good faith during an emergency situation. The autopsy clearly shows that the victim's death was caused by the severe trauma from the accident itself, combined with a pre-existing medical condition. The defendant's actions, while not professionally trained, were reasonable under the circumstances and likely gave the victim his only chance at survival. Therefore, this court finds the defendant not guilty. Dee collapsed in his chair, sobbing with relief. Huyen threw her arms around him, crying just as hard. But then something happened that no one expected. The victim's mother stood up slowly and walked toward Dae. Everyone tensed, but instead of anger, her face showed something different: broken understanding. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We were so consumed by grief that we needed someone to blame. But you tried to save my son. You gave him a chance. Thank you for not leaving him alone on that road." After the trial ended, Dee should have felt victorious. But instead, he just felt exhausted. Exhausted in body, exhausted in spirit, exhausted in ways he never knew were possible. Saving that young man's life had cost him more than $40. It had cost him weeks of anxiety, sleepless nights filled with nightmares, the trauma of being accused of causing someone's death, and a piece of his innocence about the world. That evening, as he and Huyen sat together in their small home, she asked him a question that had been on her mind. "Dee, if you could go back to that moment, knowing everything that would happen afterward, would you still stop to help him?" Dae was quiet for a long moment, really thinking about it. Then he looked at her and said, "Yes, even knowing all the pain, all the accusations, all the fear, I would still stop, because leaving him there to die alone would have been worse than anything I went through." This story raises an important question that many people face. Should we be afraid to help others because of potential consequences? The answer, as difficult as it is, must be no. We cannot let fear of litigation or misunderstanding prevent us from helping those in desperate need. What Dee's story teaches us is that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to immediate gratitude or recognition. Sometimes it leads to pain, to accusations, to having to prove your innocence. But that doesn't make it any less right. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult and emotional journey. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with others who need to hear this important message. Subscribe to Life Single Review and hit that notification bell for more meaningful stories. Comment below and tell us your thoughts on Good Samaritan laws and how we can better protect people who help in emergencies. Until next time, stay compassionate, stay brave, and remember that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when it's hard.